So we've got a market diagram. What are we going to do with this thing? As I said, the purpose of this thing is not to torture you. The purpose of this thing is to be able to talk about the real world. A lot of cases in the midterms, the exams, in tutorials, in those sorts of things, we'll be doing what I call scenario analysis, a what-if sort of thing. Here's our market. We start here, and then something happens. Now, this is a pretty simple model. There's only two curves here. There's only D and S. So in that sense, there's really only four things that can happen. So any outcome in a market is going to be basically one of those four, which is demand increases, demand shifts to the right. Demand decreases, demand shifts to the left. Supply increases, or meaning supplies increase the amount they're willing to bring into the market. The funny thing about that is supply increasing actually shifts the supply curve to the right or down. You've got to be careful about that. Supply decreasing is a shift to the left of the supply curve or up. Just have to make sure you draw that out a couple of times so you see what's going on. So there's only four stories with this very simple model. Almost all stories you'll be telling in economics are essentially one of those four. Demand went up, demand went down, supply went up, supply went down. Or think left and right. That's it. You only have to consider four cases. You draw four little diagrams. That's going to cover almost everything you do with the market. How do we normally talk about a scenario? What we normally do is you normally draw the initial equilibrium. Here I'll call that E1. So that's where you start. That's the start of the story. You know, this is the market for Chinese grooms. Wasn't that the one I had before? And there's a quantity traded, which is the number of grooms who get married. And there's a price of grooms, which is that dowry. So that's our E1. We have an initial price and initial quantity here, also marked 1. 1 just means the place at which we start. The story starts at E1. And then something happens. So here in this case, we're going to have the supply shifts out. So this is an increase in demand. Now we move out to the new equilibrium, right? The prediction is where the demand curve and the supply curve cross. So our new equilibrium is at E2, where the new demand curve, D2, and the old supply curve, which hasn't shifted, cross. That's going to have a new equilibrium price, which is higher in this case, an increase in demand, and a new equilibrium quantity. This might be, say, the case of, I was using the example here, was going to be, let's say that you're a marketing person working for a wine wholesaler. And your wine wholesaler wanted to say, okay, you know, give me an idea what's going to happen to the market for wines over the next 10 years. What sort of advice might you do? How might you do that with an economics market diagram? Well, one thing you might say is, well, there's going to be an increase in income of Australians over the next 10 years. There's going to be a big continuing mining boom. That's what Treasury keeps telling us, and the OECD. That means Australian incomes will rise. Now, we know that wine is what the book calls a normal good. A normal good is a good for which the demand of it rises as people get wealthier. As people get wealthier, they buy more wine. They buy a lot more other things as well, but one of the things they buy is wine. So what we might see then is people get wealthier over the next 10 years. The demand curve for wine shifts out to the right. And so our prediction would be that the price of wines and the quantity traded of wines in the Australian market will also rise. And then you might want to start getting more complicated and start talking about different varieties of wines or different income classifications of wines. What's going to happen to wines in the $10 range versus wines in the $20 range? What's going to happen to demand for bottles of wines in the $50 range as incomes rise? And again, you might want to use different market diagrams and talk about how demand changes as income rises, as population grows, and other sorts of things over the next 10 years in Australia. So one thing you do need to do in this subject is practice doing those sorts of diagrams. And then each time you do one of these sorts of diagrams, you need to have not a lot, but just a little bit of text explaining what is going on. What is the story? Make sure you can have 1 or 2 sentences that explains this, in this case, what happens to demand for wines as Australians grow wealthier. So practice drawing the diagrams and also writing them. how does this work? Why is P2 the right price in this scenario? Remember what we're saying is we're thinking about the market for wines. We're thinking about what's going to happen over the next 10 years in the market for wines as Australians get wealthier. And we predicted that we're going to start at equilibrium 1 with price 1 and quantity 1. And then as income rises, our demand curve for wines shifts out to the right. Right? People can afford to buy more wines, and they'll buy more wines. They might also shift out of other things, cheaper things like, say, beer, and buy more wines instead as they get wealthier. They might stop buying cheap liquors, and again, then shift into wines as they have more money and more purchasing power. Well, what would happen if demand shifted from D1 out to D2, but the price didn't change? So over the next 10 years, the demand increased, but the supply didn't. What would be wrong with saying my prediction is that the price won't change, prices can stay at P1? Well, we'd have to say that at that price of P1, the new demand for wine is actually Q3. The new supply of wine at a price of P1 is just Q1. So there's going to be, as you can see, the difference, Q3 minus Q1. There's a shortage of wine out there. At the same market price P1, there's going to be a shortage of wines. Demand is bigger than supply. So a shortage, what's that going to do? That'll drive the price of wines up. So P1 can't be our prediction for the market. It's got to be a price that's higher. In this case, it's going to be P2. So P2 is a higher price at which demand and supply of wine, quantity demanded and quantity supply of wine, is equal. So that's going to be our new market prediction for what's going to happen in the wine market 10 years from now as people get wealthier. So a shortage in market drives the price up.